Jekyll Island belonged to 100 men, and those 100 men controlled a share of the world's wealth that no private club before or since has matched. The membership roll of the Jackal Island Club, incorporated in 1886 on a Georgia barrier island reachable only by boat, included the names Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Astor, Gould, Pulitzer, and Baker. Munsey's magazine called it the richest, the most exclusive, and the most inaccessible club in the world. But the island's most consequential season was not a social one. In November of 1910, a small party of financiers and one United States senator arrived under cover of a fiction, a duck-hunting excursion, and spent 10 days in the clubhouse drafting the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve System. They told no one. They used first names only. They would deny the meeting had occurred for more than 20 years. The island sits 7 miles off the Georgia coast, southeast of Brunswick, behind a maze of salt marsh and tidal creek that made it, in the 19th century, almost unreachable without a private vessel. It is one of the 4 Golden Isles, a chain of barrier islands stretching from the mouth of the Altamaha River to the St. Andrew Sound, and for most of its recorded history it belonged to a single family. Christophe Poulain Dubignon, a French aristocrat fleeing the Revolution, purchased the island in 1792 and established a cotton plantation. His descendants worked the land for nearly a century. By the 1870s, the plantation economy was dead. The soil was tired, and John Eugene Dubignon, the great-grandson, was looking for another use for an island that had become an expensive inheritance. Dubignon found his answer in his brother-in-law, Newton Finney, who lived in New York and belonged to the Union Club, the oldest and most exclusive gentlemen's club in the city, whose membership included the men who ran the railroads, the banks, the steel mills, and the insurance companies. Finney understood that these men wanted a winter retreat far from the press and the public, somewhere warm and private where entire families could be received. Most existing hunting clubs admitted only men and offered little more than lodges in the Adirondacks or the Berkshires, where a newspaper reporter might appear at the next table. Dubignon's island offered something altogether different. It was surrounded by water. It had no bridge, no public ferry, no telegraph office. The only way to reach it was by private boat across 7 miles of salt marsh, and the only people on it were the people its owners chose to invite. In 1885, Finney and Dubignon petitioned the Glynn County courts and incorporated the Jekyll Island Club. They offered 100 shares of stock at $600 per share, roughly $15,000 in present value, and Finney set about selling them in the drawing rooms and dining clubs of Manhattan and Chicago. He encountered no difficulty. Within months, 53 men had purchased shares, and the list of original subscribers read like an index of American industrial capital. John Pierpont Morgan, whose banking house had reorganized half the railroads in the country and whose personal credit could move sovereign bond markets. Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper publisher whose fortune derived from the New York World. William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore and heir to the New York Central Railroad fortune. Marshall Field, whose department store on State Street in Chicago was the largest retail enterprise in the country. Henry Hyde, founder of the Equitable Life Assurance Society. James Jerome Hill, the railroad builder whose Great Northern Railway ran from St. Paul to Seattle. On the 17th of February, 1886, Finney signed the purchase agreement, and Dubignon's family island became the property of Northern Capital for $125,000. The members selected Lloyd Aspinwall, a prominent New York attorney, as the club's first president, with Judge Henry Elias Howland as vice president, and they hired Charles Alexander of Chicago to design the clubhouse. Alexander's drawings, published in the January 1887 issue of American Architect and Building News, depicted a rambling Queen Anne structure with a signature corner turret, wraparound verandas, bay windows, extended chimneys, and an overall asymmetry that suggested a country house rather than a hotel. The interior announced the ambitions of its membership. Ionic columns framed the dining room. Ceilings rose 12 and 15 feet. Oak wainscoting and leaded art glass lined the public rooms. 93 fireplaces served the guest chambers. The Landscape Committee, chaired by Ezra McCagg of Chicago's Lincoln Park Commission, engaged William Shaler Cleveland, second only to Frederick Law Olmsted among American landscape architects, to plan the grounds beneath the island's ancient live oaks, their branches heavy with Spanish moss. Ground was broken in mid-August of 1886. On the 21st of January, 1888, the executive committee arrived by steamer, and the Jekyll Island Club opened its doors for its first season. During those early seasons, hunting was the stated purpose. The club employed a full-time gamekeeper who kept the island stocked with pheasant, turkey, quail, and white-tailed deer. Members rode out on horseback each morning in hunting parties, and every man was required to report the day's kill and surrender it to the club kitchen, where it reappeared that evening on the dining table, dressed and served by a staff of waiters drawn almost entirely from the local black population of Brunswick and the surrounding sea islands. But hunting was also, from the beginning, a convenient fiction. The island's value was not the game. It was the company. Nowhere else in the country could a railroad president sit at dinner with the banker who had reorganized his competitor, the insurance executive who underwrote his rolling stock, and the publisher who could, with a single editorial, make or ruin his reputation, all in a single dining room with no reporter within 7 miles. The club imposed a strict cap of 100 members and enforced it for the entirety of its operational life. Admission was by invitation only, based on demonstrated wealth and social position, and the invitation carried an expectation that was never written down but universally understood. A member of the Jackal Island Club did not seek publicity, did not discuss the club's affairs with the press, and did not arrive without the financial standing to justify the company. The annual season ran from January through April, when the mild Georgia coast offered a reprieve from the winter storms of New York, Boston, and Chicago. Members arrived by private yacht, competing informally over whose vessel was the most impressive, and the evenings centered on a formal dinner in the clubhouse dining room, white-jacketed waiters attending tables of men in evening dress and women in imported gowns. The club was, in this respect, unlike the Union Club or the Metropolitan Club or the Chicago Club, all of which excluded families. Jekyll Island welcomed wives, children, and guests, and the effect was to make the island feel less like a gentleman's retreat and more like a private country, governed by its own customs, staffed by its own servants, and answerable to no authority beyond its own membership rolls. The wealth concentrated on the island was without precedent in American private life. Morgan's banking syndicate had organized United States Steel in 1901 at a capitalization of $1.4 billion, the largest corporate consolidation in history. Vanderbilt's inheritance from the New York Central Railroad alone exceeded $200 million. Pulitzer's New York World had reached a daily circulation of 600,000 copies, the largest of any newspaper in the country, generating annual profits estimated at $1 million. Marshall Field's retail and wholesale operations on State Street in Chicago recorded $68 million in annual sales by 1906, and his estate at death was valued at approximately $125 million. Hill's Great Northern Railway ran more than 5,000 miles of track from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound, built without a single dollar of federal subsidy, the only transcontinental railroad in the country that could make that claim. Henry Hyde's Equitable Life Assurance Society held assets exceeding $400 million, making it one of the largest financial institutions in the world. A frequently cited estimate, drawn from contemporary press accounts, held that the combined wealth of the Jekyll Island Club's members represented approximately 1/6 of the world's total monetary wealth at the club's peak. The figure may have been an exaggeration. It was not a large one. The club was not designed as a monument to leisure. It was designed as an environment in which the men who controlled the largest concentrations of American capital could conduct their affairs without observation. The inaccessibility was not an accident of geography. It was the point. The salt marshes and tidal creeks that separated the island from the mainland served the same function as the 100-member cap and the invitation-only admission. They kept the world out. And for 6 decades, they succeeded. The Jekyll Island Club would never issue a press release, never host a journalist, and never publish a record of the conversations held in its dining room or on its verandas. What happened on the island stayed on the island, not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of architecture. Privacy was built into the landscape itself. Within 24 years of the club's founding, the clubhouse that opened for duck hunting and formal dinners would host the drafting of a new financial order, in secret, by men who understood that the public would reject the plan if it knew whose hands had written it. The island had been preparing for that moment since the day Finney sold the first share. But the clubhouse was only the beginning. Within a decade of its opening, the members would begin building private estates along the island's interior roads, and each cottage would declare, in brick and marble and imported tile, exactly how much of America its owner controlled. The first cottages appeared in the early 1890s, modest wooden structures set back among the live oaks, built by members who found the clubhouse rooms sufficient for sleeping, but insufficient for the kind of private entertaining that their business required. Within a decade, modesty had been abandoned. The cottages that rose along the interior shell roads of Jekyll Island between 1890 and 1928 were mansions by any measure, 18 of them in all, and they represented a combined investment in architecture and decoration that dwarfed the cost of the island itself. They were not summer homes. They were declarations of position, each one furnished with the specific intention of demonstrating that its owner occupied a particular rank in the hierarchy of American wealth, and each one used for roughly 3 months of the year before being shuttered, staffed by a skeleton crew, and left to the heat and the insects of a Georgia summer. Hollybourne Cottage, built in 1890 for club member Charles Stewart Maurice, was among the earliest, its design an eclectic Tudor style, then fashionable for country estates. Sans Souci, completed in 1896, was more unusual. John Pierpont Morgan and 5 other club members commissioned a 3-story apartment building containing 6 private suites, each with its own parlor, bedroom, and bath, and the name itself, French for without care, captured the ethos of the island better than any architect's drawing. Some historians consider Sans Souci one of the first condominium structures in the United States. Cherokee Cottage, built in 1904 in the Italian Renaissance style by Edwin Gould for his in-laws, the Schradi family, faced the Jekyll River with engaged columns framing its 3 doorways. The Goodyear Cottage, finished in 1903 in the Georgian Revival style for the lumber magnate Frank Goodyear, featured one of the island's first electric elevators, installed in the neighboring Mistletoe Cottage the same year. But the two estates that defined the island's character most completely belonged to the two families whose industrial reach extended farthest beyond the Georgia coast. The Rockefeller presence on Jekyll Island was established not by John Davison Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, but by his younger brother William. William Rockefeller was the quieter partner in the family enterprise, the one who managed Standard Oil's financial operations through his directorship at National City Bank, the largest bank in the United States and the Rockefeller family's primary instrument on Wall Street. The cottage William occupied on Jekyll Island was called Indian Mound, named for the ancient shell midden of the Guala people on whose remains it stood. The house had been built in 1892 by Gordon Mackay, a Massachusetts industrialist who had made his fortune manufacturing machines for sewing shoes during the Civil War. When Mackay died in 1903, William Rockefeller purchased the property in 1905 and renovated it extensively. The finished estate contained 25 rooms, 9 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, 7 servants' quarters, a cedar-lined walk-in safe, and an elevator. The bathtub in the master bedroom had taps for both hot and cold salt water, pumped from the ocean. William conducted bank business from Indian Mound. He received visitors and associates there. In function, if not in name, it was a branch office of National City Bank, located on a private island 7 miles from the nearest town. When William Rockefeller died in 1922, he left a fortune of $150 million, accumulated largely through the financial side of the oil trust that his more famous brother had built. The Crane Cottage, completed in 1917 and occupied by early 1919, was the largest and most lavish estate on the island. It was built for Richard Teller Crane, Jr., heir to the Crane Company plumbing and valve manufacturing fortune, and designed by the Chicago architects David Adler and Henry C. Dangler. Dangler died during construction in 1917, and the house was not fully occupied until 2 years later. The finished cottage contained 30 rooms and 17 bathrooms, a number that would have seemed extravagant anywhere but on an island whose residents manufactured the nation's plumbing fixtures. The construction cost was approximately $500,000, a sum equivalent to roughly $8 million in present value. The grounds featured a formal sunken garden in the Italian Renaissance style, with imported fountains, a reflecting pool, and Italian cypress trees. The architecture announced not merely wealth, but a particular species of it. The Crane fortune was not built on railroads or oil or banking. It was built on pipes, valves, fittings, and plumbing fixtures, the physical infrastructure that made indoor plumbing possible across the American continent, and the cottage on Jekyll Island was the family's assertion that infrastructure money was as respectable as railroad money. The island's social architecture did not dispute the claim. Villa Mariana, constructed in 1928 for Frank Miller Gould, a second-generation member and son of the railroad financier Jay Gould, was the last of the 18 cottages to be completed. The architect Mogens Tvede blended Spanish eclectic and Italian Renaissance elements in its design. By the time Villa Mariana was finished, the island's building era was over. No new cottages would be added. The membership had reached its physical and social limits, and the shell roads that connected the cottages to the clubhouse formed a permanent circuit of Gilded Age and early 20th century capital, each address a biography, each facade a balance sheet. The scale of what these families controlled, taken together and measured against the national economy of their era, is difficult to convey without numbers. The Rockefeller family's combined fortune, split between John D. and William, exceeded $1 billion at its peak, a sum equivalent to more than 2% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. The Morgan banking syndicate had underwritten the formation of United States Steel at a capitalization of $1.4 billion. The Crane Company operated manufacturing plants in cities from Chicago to Birmingham and held patents on fixtures installed in tens of thousands of American buildings. The Vanderbilt Railroad system, by the turn of the century, controlled more than 20,000 miles of track and employed more than 100,000 workers. George Fisher Baker's First National Bank held assets that placed it among the 5 largest banks in the country. Edward Harkness, heir to a Standard Oil fortune, would donate more than $129 million to educational and medical institutions over the course of his lifetime, a philanthropic output that rivaled Carnegie's and exceeded most sovereign budgets of the era. The annual operating budget of the Jekyll Island Club itself, a figure that covered the gamekeeper, the kitchen staff, the groundskeepers, and the seasonal labor force drawn from Brunswick's black community, was a rounding error in the financial lives of the men who paid it. On the 25th of January, 1915, the island demonstrated that its reach extended well beyond the Georgia coast. Theodore N. Vail, president of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, had planned to participate in the first transcontinental telephone call from A&T's offices in New York, alongside the inventor Alexander Graham Bell. A leg injury confined him to Jekyll Island. Vail ordered a special extension of the line run to the island's clubhouse, a distance that stretched the total circuit from Jekyll Island to San Francisco to 4,750 miles. At 8 o'clock in the evening, seated in a parlor with J.P. Morgan, Jr. and William Rockefeller standing nearby, Vail joined the call. Bell spoke from New York. Thomas A. Watson, Bell's former assistant, answered from San Francisco. President Woodrow Wilson listened from the White House. The first 3 minutes of a transcontinental call would cost $20.70, roughly $515 in present value. The call was a public event for A&T, but it was also an inadvertent demonstration of the island's centrality. The most private club in America had, for one evening, connected its parlor to both coasts and to the presidency. The club published no records of its social calendar and issued no press releases. The only accounts of life on the island during the club era come from the private letters and memoirs of its members, and these accounts are, without exception, studiously unrevealing. The island operated as a private country with a population that fluctuated between 50 and several hundred during the season and dropped to a skeleton staff of groundskeepers and caretakers during the off months. The African-American workers, who maintained the grounds, staffed the kitchen, and served in the dining room, lived in a small settlement on the island, separate from the members' cottages, and subject to the same racial hierarchies that governed domestic labor throughout the Jim Crow South. The club's records note their employment but not their names. They were part of the infrastructure, like the 93 fireplaces and the gamekeepers' stores. Among the members and associates of the Jekyll Island Club was a Republican senator from Rhode Island whose name would, within the decade, become synonymous with the most ambitious piece of financial legislation in American history. Nelson Aldrich was not among the club's earliest formal members, but his connection to the island's inner circle preceded any enrollment by years. His daughter Abigail had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. in 1901, a union that joined the legislative branch to the Oil Trust by blood, and his chairmanship of the Senate Finance Committee had made him the single most consequential legislator in Washington on matters of tariff and monetary policy. President Theodore Roosevelt called Aldrich the kingpin of the Republican Party. Journalists, less charitably, called him the boss of the United States. Aldrich was not a man who hunted ducks. He was a man who built systems. But the system that Aldrich would build, and the island on which he would build it, required a crisis first. And the crisis, when it came, would arrive not on the Georgia coast, but on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street in Manhattan, in the marble lobby of a trust company that was about to run out of money. The United States had operated without a central bank since 1836, when President Andrew Jackson refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States and allowed it to expire. Jackson's objection was ideological. He regarded a central bank as a tool of Eastern financiers and an enemy of democratic self-governance, and he was not entirely wrong about the first part. For 70 years after the Second Bank's death, the American banking system ran on a patchwork of state-chartered banks, nationally chartered banks created under the Wartime National Banking Act of 1863, and a growing class of financial institutions called trust companies. Trust companies accepted deposits, made loans, and managed estates, but they operated outside the national bank clearinghouse system, which meant they were not subject to the same reserve requirements and could not draw on the same emergency resources when their depositors panicked. In the decade before 1907, trust company assets in New York had grown by 244%, far outpacing the 97% growth of national banks. They were the fastest-growing institutions in American finance and the least regulated. The result was an economy of extraordinary productive energy and periodic catastrophic failure. Between 1873 and 1907, the country suffered at least 5 major banking panics, each one triggered by the same structural weakness. The money supply could not expand to meet demand. When farmers needed cash to move the autumn harvest, interest rates spiked. When a bank failed, there was no lender of last resort to provide emergency credit, and the failure spread from institution to institution like fire through dry timber. The Panic of 1907 began, as American financial panics so often did, with speculation. Fritz Augustus Heinze, a copper magnate who had made his fortune in the mines of Butte, Montana, and his brother Otto attempted in October of that year to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. The scheme collapsed within days. Otto had misread the market. Short sellers found shares from sources outside the Heinze family's control, and the price of United Copper, which had risen to nearly $60 per share, fell to below 10. The contagion spread first to the Mercantile National Bank, where Augustus Heinze served as president, and to banks connected to his associate Charles W. Morse, a shipping speculator who sat on the boards of multiple financial institutions. The New York Clearinghouse examined the affected national banks, declared them solvent, and forced out Heinze and Morse. The crisis, for the moment, appeared contained. It was not. On Friday, October 18th, word reached the financial district that Charles T. Barney, the president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, had personal and professional ties to Morse. The Knickerbocker was the third-largest trust company in New York City, housed in a Roman temple building designed by McKim, Mead, and White at the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. On Monday, the 21st, Barney's board demanded his resignation. That same afternoon, the National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer serve as the Knickerbocker's clearing agent. The announcement was interpreted by the public as a death sentence. John Pierpont Morgan was not in New York when the crisis deepened. He was in Richmond, Virginia, attending the Triennial Episcopal Convention, and he returned to the city a day ahead of schedule. By Monday evening, his private library at the corner of Madison Avenue and 36th Street had become the operational center of an improvised rescue. Morgan convened George Fisher Baker, president of the First National Bank, and James Stillman, president of National City Bank. He assembled a team of young bankers to examine the books of failing trusts and determine which institutions were solvent and which were beyond help. The most important of these investigators was Benjamin Strong, then a vice president at Bankers Trust, a quiet, precise man who would, within a few years, become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Strong was sent to examine the Knickerbocker's books, but the time available was too short and the records too tangled to allow a definitive assessment. He reported to Morgan that the Knickerbocker's solvency was unclear. Morgan therefore refused to lend. On Tuesday, October 22nd, with depositors forming lines that stretched down Fifth Avenue and around the block onto 34th Street, the Knickerbocker paid out approximately $8 million through its teller windows before suspending operations shortly after noon. The suspension was interpreted by the public as a verdict. If Morgan would not save the Knickerbocker must be beyond saving. The panic, until that moment contained to a handful of institutions, became general. The numbers tell the story with a clarity that narrative alone cannot supply. Runs spread from the Knickerbocker to the Trust Company of America, whose deposits of nearly $60 million began hemorrhaging at a rate of more than $13 million in a single day. Over 2 weeks, the Trust Company of America lost $47.5 million in withdrawals. The Lincoln Trust faced similar runs. Interest rates on call loans, the overnight credit that kept the stock market functioning, spiked from 9.5% to 70% in a single day, then to over 100% by Thursday, and at times there were no offers at any rate. The New York Stock Exchange, from its January 1906 peak through November of 1907, fell nearly 50%. Secretary of the Treasury George B. Cortelyou deposited federal funds into New York banks, eventually committing $100 million in loan certificates, and it was not enough. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in the country, pledged $10 million of his personal fortune and told the Associated Press that he had faith in the underlying conditions of the country. The statement did not stop the withdrawals. On November 14th, Charles T. Barney, the former president of the Knickerbocker Trust, whose connections to Morse had triggered the first run, shot himself at his home. He died that evening. Morgan's response, in the absence of any institutional mechanism for managing a banking crisis, was to become the institution himself. He organized a series of emergency loans to the Trust Company of America and the Lincoln Trust, working from the East Room of his library while runners carried messages between his house and the offices of the major banks downtown. He negotiated over several nights a $25 million rescue pool funded by the presidents of the surviving trust companies. The negotiations were contentious. Several trust company presidents resisted committing their own capital to rescue their competitors, and when the resistance continued, Morgan locked the trust company presidents in his library on the evening of November 2nd and refused to let them leave until they signed the agreement. The doors were not opened until nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. He brokered the emergency acquisition of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company by his own United States Steel Corporation, a transaction that required and received the personal approval of President Theodore Roosevelt, who set aside his trust-busting principles for the duration of the crisis. He arranged a $30 million purchase of New York City bonds to prevent the city itself from becoming insolvent. Morgan, in those weeks, performed every function that a central bank would have performed. He assessed the solvency of failing institutions. He channeled credit from strong banks to weak ones. He set the terms of emergency lending. He decided who would be saved and who would not. He did it from a private library on Madison Avenue, answerable to no legislature and governed by no statute, and the country, having no alternative, thanked him for it. The panic subsided by mid-November, but the lesson it left behind was not subtle. One man had saved the American financial system, and that man was 70 years old. He would not live forever. He had operated without a mandate, without a budget, and without any legal obligation to act. He had also, in the course of saving the system, acquired the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company for United States Steel at a price well below its market value, a transaction that enriched his own corporation while resolving a crisis that his own decisions about whom to rescue had helped to shape. The country's banking system had been saved by its largest private beneficiary. The paradox was not lost on the Congress, the press, or the public. In 1908, the Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland ACT, emergency legislation that authorized national banks to issue additional currency during panics, and, more consequentially, created the National Monetary Commission to study the problem and recommend a permanent solution. The commission was chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. The appointment was logical. Aldrich was the most senior Republican on the Finance Committee, the acknowledged legislative authority on monetary policy, and a man whose connections to the banking system were deeper than those of any other sitting legislator. His critics considered those connections disqualifying. His allies considered them essential. The commission was given a broad mandate and a generous budget, and Aldrich intended to use both. He would spend the next 2 years traveling, studying, and consulting. He would visit the central banks of England, France, and Germany. He would arrive in Europe convinced that a central bank was unnecessary for the United States, and he would return persuaded that it was indispensable. And when the time came to draft the plan, he would not convene a public hearing or consult the full commission. He would gather a small group of men in secret on an island that already belonged to them. Nelson Wilmarth. Aldrich had entered the United States Senate in 1881 as a Republican from Rhode Island and had, over 3 decades, assembled a concentration of legislative authority that no single senator before or since has matched on matters of money. He was born in 1841 on a farm in Foster, Rhode Island, the son of a mill hand named Annan Aldrich, and his early career gave no indication of the reach he would achieve. He worked as a clerk in a grocery store in Providence, then as a bookkeeper, then as a partner in a wholesale grocery firm that dealt in sugar and other imported commodities. He married Abigail Pierce Truman Chapman, a woman of means and established family, in 1866, and he entered the Providence City Council 3 years later. By 1878, he had secured a seat in the United States House of Representatives, and by 1881 he had moved to the Senate, where the state's property-based voting restrictions and a Republican machine run by boss Charles Brayton ensured that his tenure would be long and undisturbed. Aldrich applied himself to the work of the Senate Finance Committee with the diligence of a man who understood that the tariff schedule was the single most consequential piece of legislation the federal government produced. The tariff determined the price of every imported good in the country, and the men who influenced the tariff influenced the profitability of every manufacturer, every importer, and every bank that financed them. Aldrich cultivated friendships with these men. He consulted directly with industrialists and financiers when drafting tariff rates, a practice his allies considered pragmatic and his critics considered corrupt. In 1906, the muckraking journalist David Graham Phillips published a series of articles in Cosmopolitan magazine accusing Aldrich and other senators of selling their votes to corporate interests. The year before, Lincoln Steffens had profiled Rhode Island itself in an article titled "Rhode Island, a State for Sale." Neither exposé slowed Aldrich's career. By the turn of the century, he was one of the Senate's Big Four, alongside Orville Platt of Connecticut, William Allison of Iowa, and John Coit Spooner of Wisconsin, and the four of them controlled the major committees and the legislative calendar with a grip that the progressive insurgents of the next decade would struggle to loosen. Aldrich's connections to the financial world deepened over time and eventually became indistinguishable from his legislative work. He invested in banking, street railways, electric utilities, rubber, and sugar. He sold his interest in the Rhode Island street railway system to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, whose president, Charles Sanger Mellon, was J.P. Morgan's most loyal corporate ally. In 1901, his daughter Abigail married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. at the Aldrich family estate at Warwick Neck, overlooking Narragansett Bay. The wedding joined the most consequential voice in American tariff and monetary policy to the most consequential fortune in American industry. Their grandson, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, would become governor of New York and vice president of the United States. The National Monetary Commission, created by the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of May 1908, gave Aldrich the authority and the budget to design a permanent reform of the banking system. The commission consisted of 8 senators and 8 representatives, with Aldrich as chairman, and it was charged with studying the American monetary system and recommending structural changes. Aldrich hired A. Piatt Andrew, a Harvard economics professor who had published extensively on American monetary conditions, as the Commission's official secretary and expert advisor. Andrew would later be appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, a position that placed him inside the executive branch while he continued to advise the Legislative Commission. The arrangement was irregular, but no one with the authority to object chose to do so. Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company and one of the most respected deal-makers on Wall Street, joined as an informal consultant. The commission would eventually issue 30 reports on banking systems, currency, and credit, a body of research more comprehensive than any the federal government had produced on the subject. The scope of the inquiry and the reach of the man who led it can be measured in numbers. Aldrich had served in the Senate for 29 years by the time the commission began its work. He had chaired the Finance Committee for a decade. The tariff schedules he had shaped generated more than $300 million in annual federal revenue, the single largest source of income for the United States government. The commission itself was allocated $300,000 for its research, a sum equivalent to roughly $9 million in present value, and Aldrich spent it freely, hiring staff, commissioning studies, and funding the European tour. The 30 published reports, when bound, filled more than 20 volumes. The banking system they examined held combined deposits of approximately $14 billion and included approximately 25,000 individual banking institutions, no 2 of which operated under quite the same set of rules. The Aldrich-Vreeland Act that created the commission had itself authorized the emergency issuance of up to $500 million in additional national banknotes, a stopgap measure that Aldrich regarded as a bandage on a wound that required surgery. Aldrich spent the better part of 2 years studying the problem. He traveled to England, France, and Germany with a delegation from the Commission, examining the operations of the Bank of England, the Banque de France, and the Reichsbank. He arrived in Europe opposed to the creation of an American central bank. The concept carried too much political risk. Americans had killed 2 central banks already, the First Bank of the United States in 1811 and the Second Bank in 1836, and the word central itself conjured the specter of concentrated Eastern financial power that had animated Andrew Jackson's veto 70 years earlier. Aldrich believed that no Congress would accept a central bank under that name. He was right about the politics. He was wrong about the impossibility. Germany's Reichsbank system, with its decentralized branches operating under a central coordinating authority, persuaded him that a central institution could be structured to distribute power across regions while retaining coordination at the top. Aldrich returned to the United States converted to the cause, though he had not yet found the architecture to make the cause politically survivable. The man who would supply that architecture was already in the United States, had been writing and lecturing on the subject for nearly a decade, and had been waiting, with the particular impatience of an expert ignored, for American policymakers to listen. Paul Moritz Warburg was born into one of the most prominent banking families in Europe. The Warburgs had operated M.M. Warburg and Company in Hamburg since the 18th century, and Paul had trained in the family firm before coming to the United States in 1902, having married Nina Loeb, the daughter of Solomon Loeb, co-founder of the New York investment bank Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Warburg became a partner at Kuhn Loeb and was, by the reckoning of his contemporaries, the most technically sophisticated banker in America on the subject of central banking. He was also, by his own account, appalled by what he found. In an article published in the New York Times Annual Financial Review in January of 1907, Warburg wrote that the American banking system was at about the same point that had been reached by Europe at the time of the Medicis, and by Asia, in all likelihood, at the time of Hammurabi. The comparison was not intended as a compliment. Over the following years, Warburg published a series of articles and delivered a series of speeches proposing the establishment of a united reserve bank, owned by the nation's banks, empowered to issue a flexible currency backed by commercial paper, and governed by bankers rather than politicians. His audiences were polite. His ideas were ignored. After the Panic of 1907, they were no longer ignored. Warburg became an unofficial advisor to the National Monetary Commission, writing a study on the discounting of commercial bills for the Commission's published reports. Aldrich, initially cool to Warburg's proposals, came to recognize that Warburg understood the mechanics of central banking with a precision that no one else in the country could match. A. Piet Andrew served as the intermediary, corresponding with Warburg on Aldrich's behalf and gradually bringing the senator around. By the fall of 1910, the essential elements had converged. Aldrich had the political authority. Warburg had the technical knowledge. Davison had the Morgan connections. Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank and therefore the Rockefeller family's man in the banking system, had the institutional weight. These four orbits had been separate for years. They were about to intersect in private on an island off the coast of Georgia. In November of 1910, Aldrich sent word to a handful of men. They were to arrive one at a time at a rail terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. They were to use first names only. They were to tell no one where they were going or why. On the evening of November 22, 1910, a private rail car sat attached to the rear of a southbound train at a rail terminal on the New Jersey shore of the Hudson River. The blinds were drawn. The car had been arranged, most likely by J.P. Morgan himself, who was a co-owner of the Jekyll Island Club, though Morgan did not attend the meeting and his role in organizing the logistics was never formally acknowledged. The 6 men who boarded the car that evening had been instructed by Senator Aldrich to arrive one at a time, to avoid being seen together, and to use first names only for the duration of the journey. No last names, no institutional titles. The staff of the rail car were not to know who their passengers were. If a reporter appeared on the platform, the men were to behave as strangers to one another. One of them carried a borrowed shotgun, a prop intended to support the cover story that this was a gentleman's duck-hunting trip to the Georgia coast. The 6 were Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, and the senior Republican on the Senate Finance Committee. Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's private secretary, who would keep the records and manage the logistics. A Piat Andrew, the Harvard economist, who now served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and who had spent 2 years as the Commission's expert advisor. Henry P. Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, who represented the most consequential private banking house in the country, and who possessed the kind of negotiating temperament that could hold a room of competing egos in productive alignment. Frank A. Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, then the largest bank in the United States and the primary instrument of the Rockefeller family's financial operations. And Paul Moritz Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the German-born banker who had spent nearly a decade arguing that the United States needed a central bank and who now, for the first time, had an audience with the authority to build one. Some accounts of the meeting include a seventh participant, Charles D. Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York and a Morgan ally, and an eighth, Benjamin Strong, the vice president of Bankers Trust, who had examined the Knickerbockers' books during the panic. The Federal Reserve's own historical account names 6. The discrepancy has never been fully resolved. What is not in dispute is the institutional weight that gathered in that rail car. Davison's employer, J.P. Morgan and Company, had organized United States Steel at a capitalization of $1.4 billion and had, in the 3 years since the panic, underwritten more corporate debt than any other banking house in the world. Vanderlip's National City Bank held deposits exceeding $220 million and served as the primary financial conduit for the Rockefeller family's oil, railroad, and mining interests. Warburg's firm, Kuhn Loeb and Company, was the second largest investment bank in the country, after Morgan's, and had underwritten the financing of the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and the Baltimore and Ohio railroads. Aldrich's Finance Committee controlled the tariff schedules that generated more than $300 million in annual federal revenue. Andrew's Treasury Department managed the government's gold reserves and its emergency lending authority. Between them, the 6 men in the rail car represented the 3 largest concentrations of private capital in the United States, the committee that controlled the nation's tax policy and the department that managed the nation's money. A frequently cited estimate holds that the institutions they controlled or influenced held deposits, assets, and capital amounting to roughly 1/4 of the total wealth of the United States. The estimate may have been generous. It was not implausible. The train traveled south through the night. At the Brunswick, Georgia station, the closest mainland point to Jekyll Island, Henry Davison reportedly intercepted a group of reporters who had received a tip about the senator's journey. The method Davison used to disperse them was never recorded. The result was effective. The party crossed to the island by boat and entered the clubhouse of the Jackal Island Club, which was closed for the off-season. The regular membership was not present. The club's staff, a small crew of African-American servants drawn from the mainland, had been told only that a private party would be using the facilities. They did not recognize their guests. Frank Vanderlip would later write that the servants had no idea who Ben and Paul and Nelson were. Even Vanderlip or Davison or Andrew would have meant less than nothing to them. For roughly 10 days, the 6 men worked in the clubhouse without interruption. There was no telephone contact with the outside world. There was no telegraph. The island's geographic isolation, the same quality that had made it attractive to Morgan and Vanderbilt and Rockefeller as a winter retreat, now served a different purpose. It provided the conditions for a kind of legislative drafting that would have been impossible in Washington, where every meeting between a senator and a banker was observed, reported, and interpreted. Aldrich understood that any banking plan associated with Wall Street would be dead on arrival in Congress. The plan had to be written by the men who understood banking, but it could not bear their fingerprints. The work was intensive and contentious. Warburg, by most accounts, did the heaviest drafting, translating his years of study into the specific language of a legislative proposal. Aldrich provided the political framework, identifying which provisions Congress would accept and which it would reject. Davison served as the negotiator, mediating disagreements between Warburg's technical precision and Aldrich's political pragmatism. Vanderlip contributed the perspective of the country's largest commercial bank. Andrew supplied the economic data and the Commission's accumulated research. Shelton recorded the proceedings. What they produced was a document called the Aldrich Plan, formally titled the National Reserve Association. The plan proposed not a single central bank, which was politically impossible, but a system of 15 regional reserve branches coordinated by a central board in Washington. Member banks would subscribe capital to their regional branch, and the regional branches would hold a portion of member banks' reserves, issue a new elastic currency based on gold and commercial paper, set a uniform discount rate, and buy and sell securities on the open market. The currency would be the liability of the Reserve Association, not of the federal government. The directors of the regional branches would be chosen by the member banks themselves, not by the President or the Congress, a provision that reflected the participants' conviction that banking should be governed by bankers. The total capital of the National Reserve Association was set at no less than $100 million. The plan was, in its architecture, a European-style central bank adapted to American political sensitivities. The regional structure was designed to diffuse the accusation of Eastern monopoly. The private governance was designed to insulate the system from what Warburg and his colleagues regarded as the incompetence of political appointees. The elastic currency was designed to solve the problem that had caused every American banking panic since the Civil War. Warburg would later write that the matter of a uniform discount rate was discussed and settled at Jekyll Island. The most consequential technical feature of the plan, the mechanism that would allow the money supply to expand and contract in response to the needs of the economy, was finalized in the dining room of a private club on a barrier island off the coast of Georgia. The men returned north as secretly as they had traveled south. Aldrich and Andrew departed the group at Washington. Warburg, Davison, Vanderlip, and Strong, if Strong was present, continued to New York. They had agreed that Aldrich would present the plan to the Senate under his own name, as the product of the National Monetary Commission's 2 years of study. The Jackal Island origins of the plan would not be disclosed, the secrecy held for more than 2 decades. The journalist Bertie Charles Forbes, founder of Forbes magazine, published an account of the meeting in 1916, naming several of the participants and describing the private rail car and the first-names-only protocol. No one of consequence believed him. The participants themselves denied the meeting had occurred. It was not until 1935, a quarter-century after the event, that Frank Vanderlip confirmed the account in a serialized autobiography published in the Saturday Evening Post. He wrote that despite his views about the value of transparency in corporate affairs, there was an occasion, near the close of 1910, when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. He added that none of the participants felt they were conspirators. They felt they were engaged in patriotic work. The men who gathered at Jekyll Island believed with some reason that the public would reject a sound banking plan if it knew whose hands had written it. The plan required secrecy precisely because it was designed by the people most qualified and most distrusted to design it. The paradox was not new. It was the same paradox that had defined the island since the day Finney sold the first share. Power on Jekyll Island had always depended on the world's inability to see what was happening there. The Federal Reserve was no exception. The plan was finished. But Aldrich's name was on it, and Aldrich's name, in the halls of Congress, carried the scent of Wall Street, Rhode Island privilege, and Rockefeller oil. The plan that the 6 men had drafted in secret now had to survive the one environment where secrecy offered no protection. It had to survive a democratic legislature. The Aldrich Plan was introduced to Congress in January of 1911 and formally submitted after a year of revision in 1912. It was dead before the ink was dry. The opposition came from every direction. Democrats rejected it as a creature of Wall Street, a banker's monopoly dressed in the language of reform. Progressive Republicans rejected it because Aldrich's name was attached, and Aldrich's name had become, after 3 decades of tariff manipulation and financial entanglement, a synonym for the alliance between the Senate and the money trust. Even country bankers, the small-town lenders who stood to benefit from the regional structure of the proposed National Reserve Association, opposed the plan because they believed its governance would favor the large northeastern banks at the expense of everyone else. The Pujo Committee, a subcommittee of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, chaired by Representative Arsène Pujo of Louisiana, held investigative hearings in 1912 and 1913 that revealed a system of interlocking directorates between the country's largest banks and its largest corporations, confirming what populists and progressives had long suspected. The special counsel who directed the investigation, Samuel Untermeyer, used the hearings to demonstrate that a small circle of New York financiers controlled an outsized share of the nation's credit. The phrase that attached itself to the investigation and to the era was the money trust. The election of 1912 ended the Aldrich Plan's last chance. Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. Democrats took control of both chambers of Congress. The Democratic platform included an explicit plank opposing the Aldrich Plan and calling for a revision of the banking laws that would protect the public from the domination of concentrated financial power. Nelson Aldrich, who had not sought re-election in 1910, watched from private life as the legislation he had drafted on Jekyll Island was repudiated under his own name. But the architecture survived. The man who would dismantle the Aldrich Plan and rebuild it under a Democratic name was Carter Glass, a Virginia congressman who chaired the House Banking and Currency Subcommittee tasked with drafting a replacement. Glass was not a banker. He was a newspaper publisher from Lynchburg who had entered politics through the editorial page, and he had little formal training in finance. He compensated by hiring Henry Parker Willis, a professor of economics at Washington and Lee University, who also wrote for the New York Journal of Commerce, and who was personally connected to Warburg and other advocates of banking reform. Willis became the subcommittee's special advisor, and the plan that Glass and Willis produced bore a structural resemblance to the Aldrich Plan that was impossible to ignore and politically essential to deny. The Glass Bill retained the regional reserve bank structure. It retained the elastic currency backed by gold and commercial paper. It retained the mechanism for member banks to subscribe capital to their regional branch and for the branches to hold reserves, issue currency, and discount loans. What it changed was governance. Where the Aldrich Plan had placed control in the hands of bankers, the Glass Bill shifted authority to a central board appointed by the president. Wilson insisted on this revision. He told Glass that neither Congress nor the public would accept a system governed by the men who had caused the problem the system was designed to solve. Wilson also needed to satisfy William Jennings Bryan, the most influential populist in the Democratic Party, whose supporters demanded that the new currency be an obligation of the federal government rather than of a private reserve association. Wilson accomplished both. The Federal Reserve Board, as the central body came to be called, would consist entirely of presidential appointees. The currency, designated Federal Reserve Notes, would be obligations of the United States government. The bill that Glass introduced, co-sponsored in the Senate by Robert Latham Owen of Oklahoma, moved through Congress over the course of 1913 with the momentum of a presidency that treated banking reform as its first legislative priority. The debate was contentious. Bankers who had supported the Aldrich plan found the Glass-Owen bill insufficiently favorable to their interests. Populists found it insufficiently hostile to Wall Street. Glass himself had initially proposed as many as 20 regional banks with no central coordinating board, and Wilson had overruled him. The final structure settled on 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, each governed by directors drawn partly from member banks and partly from the public, overseen by a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, whose members were appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The Federal Reserve System, as enacted, represented an institution of unprecedented scope and a structural complexity designed to disguise the concentration of authority at its center. 12 regional banks would hold the reserves of more than 7,000 member banks, whose combined assets exceeded $15 billion. The system would issue a new national currency, Federal Reserve Notes, backed initially by gold reserves of not less than 40% and by eligible commercial paper. Each regional bank was required to maintain a minimum capital of $4 million. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington, consisting of the Secretary of the Treasury, the Comptroller of the Currency, and 5 members appointed by the President, would set the discount rate, regulate the money supply, supervise the regional banks, and serve as the lender of last resort that J.P. Morgan's library had improvised during the Panic of 1907. The House passed the bill on December 22, 1913, by a vote of 298 to 60. The Senate followed the next day, 43 to 25. President Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913, less than an hour after the Senate vote. The 12 regional banks opened for business on November 16, 1914. Paul Warburg was appointed by Wilson to the first Federal Reserve Board, a position he accepted only after resigning his partnership at Kuhn, Loeb, at considerable financial sacrifice. He would later write a 2-volume history of the system's early years. Benjamin Strong, the same man who had examined the Knickerbocker Trust's books for Morgan during the Panic, and who may or may not have been present at the Jekyll Island meeting, was appointed the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most consequential of the 12 regional banks, and the one that would conduct the system's open market operations. The line from Morgan's private library on Madison Avenue to the Federal Reserve ran directly through Jekyll Island, and the man who connected them was the man Morgan had sent to read the Knickerbocker's ledgers on a Tuesday morning in October of 1907. Frank Vanderlip, writing in the Saturday Evening Post 22 years after the Act's passage, offered the most concise epitaph for the Jekyll Island plan. Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, he wrote, "Nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that was finally adopted. The secret architecture, drafted in secret by men who could not be named in a clubhouse on a barrier island 7 miles off the Georgia coast, had become the law of the land under a different name, with a different governance structure, and with the fingerprints carefully wiped from its surface. The institution born on the island outlasted the man who brought the plan to Congress. Aldrich died on April 16, 1915, 16 months after Wilson's signature at the age of 73. The institution also outlasted the island that bore it. Within 2 decades, the Jekyll Island Club itself would begin to collapse, and the salt marshes and live oaks that had sheltered the richest men in America would shelter no one at all. The Depression halved the club's membership. By 1933, the original 100-member cap had become an embarrassment rather than a distinction, and the board created a new category, associate membership, offered at a reduced price, in an effort to fill the empty chairs in the dining room. The cottages that had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to build sat shuttered for longer and longer stretches. The staff shrank. The yachts stopped arriving. World War II delivered the final blow. The club opened for the 1942 season as it had every January since 1888, but by March, the board announced an early closure. The financial situation was unsustainable, and the war had drained the local labor force. The men who had maintained the grounds, staffed the kitchen, and served in the dining room had enlisted or been drafted. United States Army troops bivouacked on the island, manning observation watchtowers along the coast to spot German U-boats operating in the shipping lanes off Georgia. The club's dining room became a military mess. The club's president expressed hope that the facilities would reopen after the war. They did not. The doors remained unlocked. The silverware remained in the cabinets. The island sat empty, its live oaks and its salt marshes reclaiming the shell roads that had once connected the homes of the richest families in America. In 1946, Melvin E. Thompson, Georgia's revenue commissioner, began exploring the possibility of purchasing one of the state's barrier islands and opening it to the public. Thompson became governor in 1947, and under his administration, the state moved to condemn Jackal Island and force a sale. The surviving club members objected. A judge ruled that the state had the authority to proceed. On October 7, 1947, the state of Georgia purchased the entirety of Jekyll Island, including the clubhouse, the 18 cottages, and all the surrounding grounds, for $675,000. The price was roughly 5 times what the club had paid in 1886, and a fraction of what the cottages alone had cost to build. The island that had been purchased by Northern capital from a French aristocrat's descendants was now the property of the state of Georgia, open to anyone who could reach it. The state attempted to operate the clubhouse as a public resort. It did not succeed. The buildings deteriorated. The operation closed in 1971, and for more than a decade, the clubhouse and the cottages sat abandoned, their verandas sagging, their leaded glass darkened, their fireplaces cold. In 1978, the federal government designated the Jekyll Island Club Historic District a National Historic Landmark. Restoration began in the middle 1980s. The clubhouse reopened as a resort hotel in 1987, and several of the cottages were restored for use as guest accommodations and event venues. The Crane Cottage's sunken garden, where Richard Teller Crane, Jr. had once surveyed his imported fountains and Italian cypress, now hosted weddings. Indian Mound, where William Rockefeller had conducted the financial business of the oil trust from a room with saltwater taps on the bathtub, became a museum. The island today is a public park administered by the Jekyll Island Authority, reachable by a causeway bridge completed in 1954, and open to tourists who walk through the rooms where the American financial system was drafted. The clubhouse dining room, where members in evening dress ate wild game shot that morning by a club-employed gamekeeper, now serves hotel guests who have arrived by automobile. The turret that Charles Alexander designed in 1886 still stands. The 93 fireplaces still line the guest chambers. The shell roads still connect the cottages. But the world that built them The world of the 100-member cap and the invitation-only admission and the private yacht arrivals and the membership roster that read like a census of American capital is gone. The institution that was born on the island is not. The Federal Reserve System, conceived in secret by 6 men in a closed clubhouse during 10 days in November of 1910, remains the central bank of the United States. Its 12 regional banks hold assets measured in the trillions. Its Board of Governors in Washington sets the interest rates that determine the cost of borrowing for every household, every business, and every government in the country. Its decisions ripple through the global economy with a speed and a force that the men who drafted the Aldrich Plan in the Jekyll Island dining room could not have imagined and almost certainly would have approved. The system they designed has been amended, expanded, restructured, and criticized for more than a century. It has never been abolished. Jekyll Island is a monument to the paradox of concentrated power in a democratic society. The men who built the club believed that the most important decisions should be made in private by the people most qualified to make them, in a place where the public could not interfere. They were not entirely wrong about the qualification. They were not entirely right about the privacy. The system that they designed in secret, by men whose names could not be spoken aloud, under a cover story of duck hunting on a barrier island accessible only by boat, endures as the most consequential financial institution on Earth. The island that sheltered its creation endures as a public park, where anyone can walk through the rooms and read the plaques, and stand in the dining room where the architecture of American money was drawn. The irony would not have been lost on the men who gathered there. They would have considered it, on balance, an acceptable price. If the history told in this documentary held meaning for you who stayed to hear it, please write a comment and tell me what you would like to hear next. There is more to uncover in the hidden architecture of American power, in the places and dynasties and fortunes that built the country and then, sometimes, broke it. The next chapter is already being written.